everyone, Amar back with another Mission Impossible episode review. This is the last one. The Revival Series, Season 2, Episode 16, The Sands of Seth. So this one starts in Cairo, where museum curator Horace Salim is angrily talking to an official named Anwar about his displeasure at Egypt taking a back seat on the world stage. And Anwar tells him to stop with his fantasies of the days of the pharaohs returning. Salim isn't happy about what he's saying, and as Anwar prepares to leave his office, a mummy, yes, that's right, a mummy, enters, not affected by Anwar's gun's bullets, and apparently chokes Anwar to death. We're not off to a great start here, but anyway. Jim heads to a dinosaur exhibit and uses spy speak with a lady. And wait a minute, that's Lucy. Lucy from The Devils. It's the same actress, Tiffany Lamb. And dang it if she's not in this crazy episode too. Unbelievable. Okay, so Jim uses spy speak with Lucy to get the disc player. The mission. Many Egyptian politicians have died under mysterious circumstances recently. Anwar was spearheading peace talks, and Salim was very critical of his policies. So the IMF must determine if Salim is involved, and if so, stop him from sabotaging the peace efforts. So the IMF set up somewhere near the pyramids, of course. And we have a sort of apartment scene at their base where we hear that Salim is obsessed with Seth, the Egyptian god of death. And he has a right-hand man named Karnak who's likely involved in all these shenanigans as well. Shannon visits a museum and watches Karnak visit Salim in his office, apprehensive about things that have been happening. Nicholas approaches Karnak as a police officer on the street, tells him that he thinks Salim has been involved in the recent murders, stirring Karnak up a bit. He talks to Salim about it, but Salim is not worried as he's sure the day of Seth is coming. Shannon approaches Salim, telling him she's working with her archaeologist father, who's found a scroll with images of Seth, hopes to use it to unlock further secrets in the digging site. That, of course, piques Salim's interest, and he says he'll come to visit their site. Grant makes a modified scroll of thought using his equipment, and that night Salim's followers bring another politician to their underground sanctum of Seth. Pharaoh wannabe Salim orders the kill, and the poor guy is choked out and tossed into a pit of quicksand. The next day, Salim comes with Shannon to the digging site where he meets her father, Jim, and looks at the scroll. Disgruntled worker Max makes a show of arguing with Jim. Shannon calms him down for Salim's benefit. Jim refuses to turn the scroll over to Salim, but agrees to keep him informed if he finds anything. That night, Nicholas gets into Salim's office, taking some pictures. The IMF sets some things up at their site, hieroglyphics and other material, in anticipation of Salim's next move of trying to strong-arm Jim into giving him the scroll and whatever else he's found. But Shannon and Max arrive with news that a tunnel has been found, and it's about to be opened. Meanwhile, Grant discovers that some of the items in Salim's room definitely point to the death cult of Seth, and the recent deaths correspond to phases of the moon. Max encounters the black-hooded thugs, who take him to Salim's office after a brief fight, during which Max loses his signaling device. Max admits to Salim that he's basically in this for the money, but demonstrates his understanding of the scrolls used for the moon phase calendar, indicating that a reckoning is to come, impressing Salim. Max says that Jim has found a path to the tomb of Seth's high priest, but has not opened it due to a warning curse or something. Salim tells Karnak that he's on mummy duty again, and he tries to attack Shannon at the digging site until Jim interferes, but he's subdued by the black-robed thugs. Salim and Max arrive, looking over the glyphs, indicating that they'll take what they want from the tomb and leave Jim and Shannon sealed inside to appease the ancient gods and their curse of death on would-be tomb defilers. Scoundrel Max shows some remorse at Shannon's plight, but leaves with Salim to be a part of the new Seth order, as they admire the mummy of the high priest back at the museum, and Salim reveals his plan to incite the revolution in anticipation of Seth's return. Max is taken to the Seth temple for initiation, and as Jim and Shannon wait for the rescue, the mummy of the high priest suddenly comes to life, turning into the yet a character from World Championship Wrestling, if you get that reference, scaring Karnak out of his wits and knocking him out with a ring. Of course, it's actually Nicholas, who signals Grant, tells him to go get Jim and Shannon, which he does. At the underground sanctum, Max gets an eyeful of Salim's lair, while Grant arrives to take Karnak away. Nicholas stays behind to find some more information, unaware that one of the Black Robes is watching. Grant takes Karnak out into the desert and speaks as a Nubian oracle, telling Karnak the curse is on him until the killings are stopped. Karnak slinks away, heads to the temple as Nicholas finds Salim's hit list, but is knocked out by the Black Robes and taken away. Karnak tries to convince Salim and the throng to abandon Seth to save their souls. One gets no prizes, how that turns out for Karnak. The IMF tracks Karnak to the temple, but they lose him as he heads below ground until Shannon steps on a hidden Seth statue covered by the desert sand, from where they can see the temple far below, and Grant climbs down to get a better look. Nicholas is brought in as the next sacrifice, and Salim is pleased to get rid of the meddlesome policeman, instructing new initiate Max to take care of the deed. Grant realizes that using the signaling devices might cause the temple to cave in, and Jim realizes that it's almost sunrise, and the material inside the Seth statue is designed to reflect the sun's light into the temple. Max goes through the motions of garroting Nicholas as Grant knocks out one of the Black Robes, takes his place, pressing a button which shows the hieroglyphics of curse on the scroll, and igniting it as the sun's light comes in, frightening Salim. Nicholas gets up. Grant tells the others that Karnak was right. Salim lied to them about Seth being a god of death and wanting them to kill, and he has given Nicholas life again. So Salim takes the Disney villain Death as the cultists toss him into the quicksand where he continues to claim to be Pharaoh, and Grant starts the trembling, burying the temple back into the sands of time. The IMF makes its exit for the final time. Mission accomplished. I'm going to give this episode a grade of a D-. It's on par, I feel, with the episode from last season called The Haunting. It's kind of a just-so script where it's, the writers just kind of had it reflect the setting. That one was Hawaii, this one is Egypt, where it just kind of plays out the way that it does. The IMF is just going against a not very formidable opponent, and any difficulty that they encounter during the mission is so contrived that it's borderline laughable. I'll discuss it further. The only thing I look at in this episode and say that, okay, that's kind of neat, is a couple of things which are a little bit related. There at least is some discussion and foundation laid of the whole idea of the communicator signaling devices that the IMF uses causing, resonance with the ancient stone of the pyramids. And, that causes some rumbling and some disruption to the signal and that sort of thing. At least, whether it's true or not, at least it's internally consistent. And so the way that plays out over the episode and allows them to use that towards the end to, bury the temple completely and all of that at least is okay. I also like the fact that Grant and Max get some time in the limelight to shine a little bit. Max, amazingly enough, is the one who drives most of the action with Horace Salim. And that's really interesting. This is actually the first time that Tony Hamilton was allowed to do that. Too bad it's the last episode. And usually, Grant also doesn't get to, kind of be in the face of, the bad guy, so to speak. He has in various episodes. But here, he not only gets to do the gadgetry stuff, where obviously he excels, but he also gets to play some roles over there as, Jim and Shannon and even Nicholas kind of take a little bit of a back seat. So this episode is unique in that way, and I feel that both Phil Morris and Tony Hamilton do a good job of taking advantage of their minutes in this one. But now let's go back to reality here. We got to start by talking about the villain, of course, in an episode like this where I'm going to give it a D-. Horace Salim just is one of those villains who takes the pennies from heaven that the IMF offers him, does almost no due diligence, There's not a huge challenge or degree of difficulty for the IMF. It's not like they had to do a crackerjack job here. They're not going up against the sharpest knife in the drawer. It's just kind of like a humdrum mission for them, frankly. I will say that Tim Elliott, who plays Horace Salim, I'll give the producers credit for their casting choice. He's got the right kind of face and mannerisms where I can believe that this guy is kind of an unhinged psychopath in a sense, for what it's worth. I'm sure Tim Elliott is a very, very nice man. He's no longer he was a nice man. He's no longer with us. So it's an okay casting choice as far as that goes. We get Gerard Kennedy again as Karnak. You may remember him from the last season's episode, Holograms, where he was Colonel Usher and the main target there. So in terms of the casting, yeah, that I'll give the producers a little bit of credit for that. However, going back to Salim, I cannot consider him anything but a lame schmuck in every imaginable way as a villain. And in terms of the third kiss of death, unengaging, that's a little difficult to kind of put on him. He's certainly not he's certainly not a very charismatic villain, I wouldn't say. I think the adjective I would use is somewhat clownish. I'll have more to say about that in a little bit when I compare him to some other things and do a little bit of do some callbacks. But the bottom line is that nothing that Horace Salim does or says makes me take him seriously at all. Like, what am I supposed to get from this guy other than his lameness and schmuckery? He strikes me as another one of those villains where I say to myself, how is a guy who is so self-unaware and self-deluded, how does he even have a job? I just don't get it. The Disney villain death is eminently predictable. The moment you see that quicksand, you just know that is exactly where Horace Salim is destined to finish. And I guess that the writers decided that having Tim Elliott portray Salim as a totally over-the-top, disconnected from reality villain would at least establish some logical consistency within the story. Your mileage may vary on that, and I would say that sure, if you want to celebrate that as a small victory, go ahead. But that certainly doesn't make the episode any better. With a lot of this episode, in terms of the way that it plays out, it's one of those kind of it is what it is things. When you do have a villain who's kind of created a reality of their own, and you want to defeat that villain, you kind of have to you have to play that game in a sense, right? Grant has to go through this charade with Karnak to try to say that, hey, you have to, tell the people in your cult to stop what they're doing, or else the curse is going to be on you. If a guy is going to believe that there's a curse, there's only one way to get to deal with that. You have to give him a way to lift the curse. So that's what they do. Same thing with the rest of the IMF. They have to play Salim's game because that is the reality that he is in. That said, I'm really, again, disappointed in the IMF with the sequence where Salim and Karnak and his thugs come to the tomb of the high priest. And the IMF is caught flat-footed where they don't know that Salim is arriving. The writers and producers try and explain it in that Max has lost his signaling device, and so he can't let the IMF know when Salim is coming. I get that. However, here's the problem. The IMF certainly knows that eventually Salim is going to come, and they can't be so stupid as to think that he's not going to come with his thugs and try and strong arm away whatever prize they think they have. So for Jim and Shannon to end up, entombed in the site that was dug is just so preposterous. First of all, it's not a real archaeological site. The IMF made it, right? They created it for this very purpose, to trap Salim. So why would they have made it in such a way that they didn't have an exit of their own, a hidden exit, or some way to get out? Some hidden button to open the door from the inside. Grant comes and opens the door for them from the outside. Even if they did design it so the door can only be opened from the outside, so as to kind of keep up the charade for Salim, that's the kind of door that would have been made back thousands of years ago. That's fine, but the IMF had to anticipate that. And that is really the only thing in the episode that causes some kind of suspense. It's the only sort of thing that kind of goes wrong. And if that's what you're going to do, at least try and do it in some kind of sensible way. I mentioned before, if the producers are going to try and make it so that we create some logical consistency by saying, look, this villain is totally over the top, because of course he is. How else could he not be? Well, okay, let's have some logical consistency with some of these things as well, please. It also, of course, at the end, just to kind of bring it all together, the Seth statue becomes a reflector of the sunlight. Okay, except here's the problem. The sun moves, right? It's not in the same place every day at sunrise. So again, we're just supposed to believe that just on that day, the sun is just in the perfect place where it can be a reflector. It is kind of rounded, so at a certain time of year, it could work. But even there, that is kind of lame, that the sun just happens to be at the right place at the right time for the right effect to make the plot play out the way that the producers wanted it. In terms of callbacks about this episode, the only one that I can really call back to in the original series would be the season 1 episode, The Legend. And the only reason for that is because of the fact that we have such an over-the-top, unhinged psychopath of a villain. Frederick Rudd in that episode, and Horace Salim in this one. And kind of the way that they go out, there's kind of a little bit of a symmetry there. Rudd goes out with the whole "let me be your Führer" thing. And, with Salim, it's obviously "I am Pharaoh," he says, as he's, sinking into the quicksand. But I gotta tell you, as unhinged as both of them were, compared to this guy, Rudd was like the paragon of stability and genius compared to Horace Salim. So that's kind of where that comparison begins and ends. In terms of some other callbacks to previous stuff in the revival, when I looked at the way the cultists were portrayed in this one, it reminded me of Cargo Cult from a few episodes ago, where we had Stone Age people who worship the volcano god, and here we have kind of a similar thing. Not judging beliefs or anything like that, but still, we're talking about people who obviously are not playing with a full deck here. At least the Stone Age people, so-called Stone Age people, in that episode were a little bit pitiable, because, they had no basis for, understanding anything about the modern world. Here, we just have people who are gullible, superstitious morons. I don't know how else to say it. I'm also reminded a little bit of the episode The Gunslinger from earlier this season. I was reminded a little bit of the way, when Horace Salim was talking about the times of the pharaohs. We had in The Gunslinger, Senator McClintock, talking about his admiration of a dead and lost time, in that case, the American West. And Jim talks to him about, your so-called heroes were basically murderers and thieves, and McClintock takes umbrage to that. And, there's not a similar conversation here about, the pharaohs, good or bad or whatever. but it did kind of remind me of that. However, the most obvious callback here, and the one that I'm sure you're waiting for me to talk about, hopefully you are, hopefully you're watching because you find some of the things I'm saying interesting, would be from last season's episode, The Devils. When I reviewed that episode, and you can find that right here, I mentioned that I, I said that this is probably the worst story, the way that it was written and the way that it came across. Talking about that episode, The Devils. And at the time, I said I wasn't completely prepared to say that The Devils was the worst episode of the Revival series. And by extension, that would mean that it's the worst episode of Mission Impossible there is. One of the reasons that I said what I said, that I wasn't prepared at that point to declare The Devils the worst, was because I was thinking about this episode, and I was also had kind of the, I knew that there was also the Führer's Children and Cargo Cult. And there might have been another episode that I was thinking that, you know what, I'm going to have to look a little more critically at those ones before I, declare one of them the worst. Well, in looking at this, as I've said in this review, at least, I'm able to find, little bits of niceness about the way that Grant and Max get some extra time and, a little bit of attempts at least at some logical consistency so that I can say that this one is not a complete failure, but it's about as close as you can get. And that's why I'm certainly sticking with the D-. In terms of comparing the villains, though, this is the one that I was thinking about the most. Because I was thinking, okay, if we compare Horace Selim as an unhinged psychopathic villain compared to Lord Holman, at least Lord Holman, I would say, was moderately sane. It's unclear to what level he believed his own shtick. About the whole Satanism thing. Clearly he had, some attachment to it. He obviously had some level of belief in it. But he was using it for worldly gain, in a sense. He was trying to, trap important people in the government, and I'm sure there were business people and that sort of thing, as part of his cult so that he could exercise some control over them in whatever way that he wanted. And I thought about that and I said, okay, if that's the case, isn't that a point in favor of that episode, The Devils, that at least you have kind of a more sane villain? Okay, let's table that idea for now. Horace Selim, as I've already mentioned, has completely gotten drunk on his own Kool-Aid. He honestly believes that he can reinvent the time of the pharaohs and that he will be Pharaoh and that he is Pharaoh. He even declares it at the end. And that's why I kind of made the analogy to what Senator McClintock from The Gunslinger was trying to do. And that's how the writers kind of presented it. In terms of structure, this episode is very similar. The writers thought of a setting. They kind of, put a mission. They created a mission kind of around that setting, and plot holes be damned. This is what we're going to do, and we're going to tell a story about it. Okay, whatever. However, here's why I would say that, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because at some point I will do a ranking in some shape or form of the Revival episodes as well. The bigger problem with the episode The Devils, comparing the villains notwithstanding, was that the IMF, I think some of this happens in this episode, but not to the same degree. The IMF is just brought down to the level of their lame opponent. Normally in the original series, when they were going up against a lame opponent, the complaint was usually, do we really need an elite task force to take care of this schmuck? And it seemed like the IMF was ganging up on them. Now in the Revival, the IMF just kind of comes down to their level and has a lot of idiocy of their own. I pointed out here about how they should have easily anticipated. That was really the only thing that they had to anticipate, that they would have to protect themselves against what Salim might do when he got to the tomb that they had set up for him. Gosh, I say that again, and now I'm even more upset at how ridiculous that is that Kim Phelps was asleep at the wheel again. However, the idiocy that came across from the IMF, lame dialogue, no planning, no taking advantage of any opportunities, not even really having a plan in the first place, it seemed, and just kind of winging it. That's the impression that I got. And most of all, as I pointed out in that review, Jim, for the sake of the mission, allowing Shannon to be put at serious risk and basically molested. A sharp contrast to what we just saw in the previous episode, Church Bells in Bogota, where Jim does a complete 180 on that for whatever reason. And I discussed that in that review. So that's why I'm going to say that, yeah, maybe Lord Holman was a little bit of a saner villain, and this guy is completely off the deep end. And from that point of view, that was one of the things in the back of my mind to say that potentially this episode might end up being worse. But I'm going to go back on that. No, The Devils was definitely the worst, and I'm going to stick with a D- for this one. Well, it's that time. I've come to the end of the reviews for the Revival series. It's interesting, when I think back to the review that I did for the end of the original series from season 7, Imitation, which you can also find here, I remember commenting that at that time, you know what, after everything that had happened in season 7 and the way that the series had turned, I was ready to move on. I was ready for the revival, to get back to some more quality plots and better episodes overall. Now I say to myself, boy, how do I feel about the end of this? And in kind of a weird way, I'm a little bit hungry for more. I really wish, and I can't put into words exactly why, but I wish that there had been more of the Revival series. For those who may not know, the Revival just kind of had difficulty competing with the audience that they were given. Mission never pulled in tremendous ratings during the Revival. If you want to have a look in the Mission Impossible dossier, which I pointed out many, many times before, and if you haven't got it, order it on Amazon. It's a fantastic book. The first season of Mission did okay in the ratings. It was put on a Saturday night time slot, which is not ideal, but it managed to kind of hold its own there. And, it was put on reruns as well. So, I remember often seeing it, shown at midnight, like on a Thursday or a Friday night, as well as at its Saturday time slot. And then for season 2, things changed. What the network decided to do, and I think it was CBS, but I'm not 100% sure, is they put it on Thursday night at 8 o'clock, opposite The Cosby Show. And you can imagine that, in 1989, that was basically just absolutely a death slot. Then they kind of juggled it around, to Sunday and that sort of thing, but by that time it was way too late. And it could be argued, and I would argue, that when the network is going to jack a program's timing around like that, it's sending an obvious signal that this is not a priority for whatever reason. So, the order was fulfilled for however many episodes were contracted to be made, and then the network pulled the plug on it, and that was that. So that was basically the end of this series. It's interesting perhaps to think about whether there could be yet another revival. I'm really tempted to think that the answer is no, for all sorts of reasons. The most obvious reason is that, the holder of the the IP, the intellectual property of Mission Impossible, basically rests in the hands of Tom Cruise and probably a few other people who I'm sure would have no interest in, reviving a TV series, or even if they did, they would take it in a direction that would not be faithful to what we see here. But even that aside, now we have, there are lots of shows out there with this kind, with the kind of mission-esque feel, where you've got like a police force or the FBI or whatever, using gadgetry and using techniques similar to the trends that that Mission Impossible set over the years. So I think it's unlikely that it will ever come back. What could have been? As I pointed out, what a great time for the show to be there in the late 80s when technology was, was a lot of technology was blooming, but we weren't quite at the level of the internet or cell phones or things like that. So a show like this could really kind of make its mark. Anyway, let me bring this to a close. What's going to happen now, you may be wondering? Well, I still have to make some more best of lists. I definitely do intend on finishing that. I would still love to get your ideas on other best of lists that I can do. I'm hoping to try and get in touch with Peter Lupus again. He did indicate to me the last time when I spoke to him that he was going to be back in May. So I'll see if maybe there's a possibility there. I do certainly intend, because I've been going back and looking at some of my older reviews, now that I've learned some things about recording and editing and all of those sorts of things, I would like to redo some of that and maybe add to some of that. So trust me, there still will be activity on the channel. I really, really look forward to your comments and ideas about other things that can be done. I really would like to hear from the community now of content that they would like to see. So I would really, really appreciate your comments and ideas. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because as I said, there will be more content and you'll get notified of that content. Please like this review video, and as I've said now for the third time, I guess, please continue with the comments and ideas. I'll see you guys soon with the last reviews, the best of Dane Badler and the best of Barbara Bain, and more to continue in the future. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.